A high country at first light, snow on the peaks, a valley below, brown and dying under a drought that came too early and meant to stay. Pull down, past the timberline, past a cabin built higher than a sane man builds, a coat torn at the shoulder, 6 years old, the last thing a pair of hands made before a river took the only family he had left. Now follow him down the mountain, a town that has a ladder, and a woman at the very bottom of it.
But inside those stone walls, something very different was happening. While her neighbors built the same timber cabins their fathers had built, and their fathers before them, one woman was quietly solving a problem the frontier had forgotten how to see. She was not trying to be clever. She was not trying to prove the men wrong. She was simply remembering something the rest of them had lost. And when the blizzard came, the one that would freeze wells solid and collapse roofs across 2 counties and drive grown men to burn their own furniture just to keep their children breathing, her stone hut would stand as silent proof that the old ways still mattered. Her name was Adeline Merrick. She was 34 years old, a widow and the mother of 2 children. Her husband had died 2 winters earlier when his freight wagon broke through the river ice on a crossing he had made 100 times before. The river took him quietly, the way the frontier took so many men, without warning and without mercy. Many women would have walked away from the homestead claim after that. They would have gone back east to family or remarried the first man who offered, or simply given up and let the land return to what it had been. Adeline stayed, not to prove anything, not to impress anyone. She stayed because she had nowhere else to go, and because the winter had already taught her a hard lesson, one she did not intend to forget. The log cabin her husband had built was standard Montana work, pine logs stacked and chinked with mud and moss, a single stone chimney that smoked when the wind turned, a dirt floor covered with rough planks that warped and lifted with every thaw. It worked, but only barely. Every winter was the same fight, burning cord after cord of wood just to keep the cold from biting at the children while they slept, rising every few hours through the long black nights to feed the fire, watching the heat climb to the ceiling and vanish through the gaps in the walls as fast as she could make it. By the spring of 1883, Adeline had lived through 3 winters in that cabin, 3 winters of waking with frost on the inside of the door, 3 winters of a fight she was slowly losing, and she had decided she was done losing it. She remembered something from her childhood, back in the high country of southern Colorado. Her father had been a stonemason, a hard, quiet man who had come over from Cornwall as a boy and carried the old country's knowledge in his hands. He built root cellars and stone rooms that stayed cool through the worst of summer and never once froze in the dead of winter. She remembered him standing in those cool, dim spaces, his rough hand flat against the wall, telling her how stone held heat differently than wood, how thickness mattered more than height, how patience mattered more than speed, how a man could not fight the cold and win, but a man who understood the cold could make it work for him instead. She had been a girl, then half listening, more interested in the world outside, but the words had stayed with her buried deep, waiting for the day she would need them. When the snow melted that April and the hillside behind her came bare and brown into the light, Adeline made a decision. She would not rebuild the cabin. She would not chink another wall or stack another log. She would build something different, something her father would have recognized, something the men of the Judith Basin had never seen. This was the first turn that no one saw coming. A widow with 2 children and a failing homestead who by every measure of common sense should have been begging timber off her neighbors or packing for the railroad east instead, announced that she meant to raise a house of stone with her own 2 hands. When word of it reached the settlement, the men did not even bother to argue. They laughed. A woman building with rock, they said, as though the very idea were a child's game. She would freeze before the first hard frost. She would be back hat in hand, begging for help before Christmas. The frontier had a way of humbling people who tried to be different, and Adeline Merrick, they all agreed, was about to learn that lesson the hard way. She started gathering stone in May, sandstone from the ridge that ran along the northern edge of her claim. River rock smoothed round by 100 years of current pulled from the creek bed in the cold morning water. Chunks of pale limestone from an old buffalo wallow where the ground had been worn down to bare rock long ago. She had no help and no money to hire any. She built a low sled from cabin scraps and hauled the stone down piece by piece, her back bent and her hands raw, stacking it near a flat patch of ground at the base of the hill. Her son, a boy of 9, worked beside her when he could. Her daughter, younger, carried the smaller stones in her apron. It was slow, brutal work. It was the kind of work that broke men. Adeline did not break. Neighbors saw her at it and stopped to ask their questions. A rancher named Ambrose Teller, a heavy, proud man who ran cattle on the open range to the east, rode past one afternoon and reined up at the edge of her property. He sat his horse and watched her wrestle a flat stone into place, and there was something in his face that was not quite cruelty, but was close to it. The amusement of a man watching another person fail. "Building a fence, are you?" he called down. "Something like that," she answered, and did not look up. She was not looking for attention. She was not looking for approval. She was looking for survival, and she had learned long ago that survival did not care what the neighbors thought. By July, the walls began to rise. The hut was small, 16 feet by 20, smaller than the cabin she was leaving behind, but every inch of it had a purpose. The walls were thick, not for strength, but for function. 2 full feet thick at the base, narrowing slightly as they climbed. She laid each stone with a care that bordered on devotion, mixing clay and sand into a mortar, the way her father had shown her, checking every course against a weighted string he had given her years before, a plumb line worn smooth by his own dead hands. She worked from first light until she could no longer see. Some nights she fell asleep against the half-built wall, too tired to walk the few yards back to the cabin, and woke with the dawn and started again. The north wall she cut directly into the hillside, burying it 3 full feet into the cold earth. The ground itself would become her insulation, a great mass of soil pressing in around the stone, holding its temperature steady against everything the sky could throw at it. The other 3 walls stood above ground, but she banked them with soil and sod, packing the earth high against the stone so that from a distance the hut seemed to grow out of the hill rather than sit upon it. The structure did not fight the land. It leaned into it. It became part of it. The roof was low and heavy, built from overlapping logs and sealed over with a thick layer of clay and sod. The ceiling inside barely reached 7 feet at its highest point. There was nowhere for the heat to climb and hide. She built the firebox against the western wall, choosing dense river stone that would soak up the heat and hold it without cracking under the strain. The chimney she kept short and narrow, just tall enough to draw the smoke clear, no taller, because she knew that a tall chimney pulled the warmth out of a house as surely as it pulled the smoke. There were only 2 small windows, both set into the southern wall to catch the low winter sun, both covered with oiled canvas stretched tight against the wind. The door was thick pine set deep into a frame of fitted stone so that no draft could find its way around the edges. Everything that looked crude to a passing eye was in truth calculated down to the inch. This was the second turn, and it was a quieter one, but it cut deeper, because not everyone who came to her claim came to laugh. A carpenter named Cornelius Wen rode out in the heat of late August, and he did not mock her at all. He walked the perimeter of the rising hut slowly, his eyes moving over the joints and the courses with the trained attention of a man who built things for a living. And what he had to say was not cruelty. It was something far more dangerous. It was reason. "Stone doesn't breathe the way wood does," he told her, and his voice was not unkind. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, an older man, careful in his words. Wood lets the damp pass through it. It lives and moves with the seasons. Stone holds everything in, the moisture from your fire, from your cooking, from your own breath in the night. It will build up in those walls with nowhere to go. By February, you will have mold creeping up the corners. By March, the air in here will be thick enough to choke on. I have seen it happen. I have seen good men try to winter in root cellars and come out sick. I am not telling you this to be hard on you, Mrs. Merrick. I am telling you because it is true. And the terrible thing was that it sounded true. It sounded like the kind of thing a sensible person would believe. Adeline stood there in the half-finished doorway of the thing she had broken her body to build, and for the first time since the snow had melted, doubt moved through her like cold water. What if the carpenter was right? What if her father's old country wisdom did not hold here, in this thin, dry mountain air so far from the green, damp hills of Cornwall? What if she had spent her one good season, her last reserves of strength, building a tomb instead of a home? She had 2 children. She had no second chance waiting for her if this failed. The weight of it pressed down on her in that doorway heavier than any stone she had carried. But she did not answer him with argument, because she had no argument to give. She had only her memory. She had only the image of her father's hand, flat against a cool, dry wall in a Colorado summer, and the certainty in his voice when he said the old builders knew what they were doing. She had only the feeling deep in her bones that the men who had survived 1,000 winters before her had learned something worth remembering. So she thanked Cornelius Wend for his honesty, and she watched him ride away, and then she picked up the next stone and laid it into place. She would trust the dead over the living. She would trust her father over the carpenter, and she would find out by spring whether that trust would save her children or bury them. By September, the hut was finished. It did not look like a home that people admired. It looked, if anything, like a root cellar, squat and dark and pressed into the earth. And that was when the talk truly began. At the settlement store where the men gathered to trade and complain and measure one another, the widow's stone hut became a favorite subject. Stone gets cold, they said, passing the words around like a shared joke. Stone draws the heat right out of you. She will be shivering in that cave by November and back in a proper cabin by spring if she lasts that long. Ambrose Teller told anyone who would listen that he had ridden past it himself, and that it was the darkest, strangest thing he had ever seen a person try to live in. A grave with a chimney, he called it, and the men at the store laughed and slapped the counter, and the words traveled on the wind the way all cruel words do. Adeline heard the talk. In a settlement that small, no one could help but hear. She heard it at the store when she went for flour and salt. She heard it in the careful, pitying way the other women spoke to her, the way a person speaks to someone they expect to bury. She heard it in the silence that fell when she walked into a room, and she said almost nothing in return. She had lived through enough winters to trust her own memory over the opinions of men who had never laid a single stone in their lives. She had buried a husband and raised 2 children alone on a piece of land that did not want them, and she had learned that the loudest voices were rarely the ones worth listening to. So she let them talk. She moved her family into the stone hut as the first cold nights came down off the mountains, and she waited. By late October, the talk began to fade. There were other things to occupy the settlement, other failures and other dramas, and the widow in her stone hut became just another odd shape on the landscape, no longer worth the breath it took to mock. Adeline did not mind being forgotten. She had never wanted to be remembered. She wanted only to be warm and to keep her children warm through whatever the coming winter would bring. And she could feel it coming. She could feel it in the way the light changed, in the smell of the air, in the deep instinct that every soul who has wintered on the high plains carries in their blood. Something was building up there in the north behind the mountains, something patient and enormous and cruel. The real test was close now. She had built her answer. Soon the question would come. The first snow fell on the second day of November. It came soft, and early in the morning a thin white veil settling over the brown grass and the bare hills, and the children pressed their faces to the oiled canvas windows to watch it. It was beautiful the way the first snow always is, before a person remembers what it means. Adeline stood in the doorway of the stone hut and watched it fall, and she did not find it beautiful. She found it a warning. A few days later, the snow came heavier, and the creek that ran below her claim froze hard from bank to bank, the water locked under ice thick enough to walk on. The world was closing down for the season. The long siege was beginning. By the middle of November, the air had turned sharp and bitter, the kind of cold that found its way through wool and into the bone. In the timber cabins across the Judith Basin, the men began the winter ritual their fathers had taught them. They stacked their wood high against the walls. They stuffed rags into the gaps where the wind whistled through. They built their fires up hot in the mornings and fed them all day long, and they told themselves, as men have always told themselves, that this winter would be like the last, hard but survivable, a thing to be endured and outlasted. Inside the stone hut, Adeline did something different. She built one small fire in the firebox of dense river stone, and she let it burn down steady, and she watched the heat sink into the walls instead of rising into the air, and she felt the stone begin to give it back, slowly, patiently, exactly as her father had said it would. She did not yet know what was coming. None of them did, but the mountains knew. On the 18th day of November, far to the north and west, the sky began to change in a way that none of the old-timers had words for. The temperature, already low, began to fall, not slowly the way it usually fell with the coming of night, but fast, plunging downward, as though a door had been opened somewhere into the deepest cold of the earth. The wind rose out of the northwest, and it carried snow before it, and the snow did not drift gently down the way the first snow had. It came sideways, driven hard, a white wall, moving across the land and swallowing everything it touched. The fence posts vanished, the trail vanished, the settlement vanished behind a curtain of howling white. The blizzard had arrived, the one they would still be talking about 100 years later, the one that would test every wall and every roof and every soul in 2 counties. And while families all across the basin threw open their woodpiles and fed their fires without rest, watching the frost form on the inside of their walls, even as the flames roared, Adeline Merrick stood in the doorway of her stone hut and looked out into the screaming white. Then she stepped back inside. She closed the thick pine door deep in its stone frame, and she felt the silence fall as the wind was shut away. She added a single log to the steady coals in the firebox. She looked at her 2 children safe and warm in the low golden light, and she sat down beside them. Outside, the storm threw itself against the earth with a fury that would break lesser shelters into kindling. Inside the stone walls, the air was warm and still, and the only sound was the soft settling of the fire and the slow, patient breathing of stone that had drunk the heat and would not let it go. The frontier had laughed. Now the blizzard would have its say, and the stone hut waited in the dark to answer it. The blizzard did not ease with the coming of night. It grew stronger. The wind slammed into the timber cabins of the Judith Basin like a living thing, like something with a will and a hunger, forcing its way through the gaps in the logs and under the doors and around the edges of windows that had seemed tight enough only a day before. Snow packed against the walls and buried the fences and rose in long white drifts that swallowed whole wood piles overnight. By the gray hour before dawn, the temperature had fallen below 0, and it was still falling, and across that wide frozen country, families woke to cold floors and frozen breath hanging in the air above their beds like the ghosts of their own warmth. In the timber cabins, the fires burned hard and fast and gave back almost nothing. The men fed their stoves every hour through the night, breaking the rhythm of sleep into ragged, useless pieces, rising in the dark to shove more wood into the flames, and then lying back down to shiver. The women stuffed rags into every crack where the wind screamed through, and still the wind found new ways in. The heat rose to the ceiling, the way heat always rises, and there it struck the cold roof and died, leaving the floors and the corners and the beds in a creeping, deadly chill. The chimneys struggled under the weight of the snow piling against them. Some smoked back into the rooms, filling the cabins with a stinging haze. Others pulled the heat straight up and out into the storm, drawing the warmth from the house as fast as the fire could make it, so that a family might sit 3 feet from a roaring blaze and still watch their water bucket skin over with ice. Ambrose Teller, the rancher who had called the widow's hut a grave with a chimney, burned through his stacked firewood by the second day. He had laughed loudest at her, and now he sat in his own well-built cabin and watched his breath cloud in front of his face. He was a big man, a strong man, a man who had broken horses and driven cattle through weather that killed lesser men, and none of his strength meant anything against this. When the wood ran low, he broke apart a chair and fed it to the fire. Then he broke apart a second chair. By the second night he had started on the table, his wife had brought all the way from Minnesota, splitting the good oak with an axe in his own front room, feeding the carved legs and the smooth, worn top into a stove that devoured everything and gave back nothing but a thin, failing warmth that could not reach the corners of the room. His cabin was sound. It was as well built as any in the basin, and it could not hold the heat. The wind found paths through it that he had never known existed, and for the first time in his proud, hard life, Ambrose Teller began to be afraid. He looked at the splintered ruin of his wife's table burning in the stove, and he thought, without wanting to, of the squat little hut of stone 3 miles north, and the woman he had laughed at, and he wondered for one cold moment whether she was warmer tonight than he was. Then he pushed the thought away because it was too bitter to hold, and he broke apart another chair. Cornelius Wend, the carpenter, fared a little better, because a careful man builds a careful house. His cabin had heavier logs and a solid stone hearth that he had laid himself, and he knew his trade well enough to have sealed it tighter than most. But better was not the same as good, and by the second night the far corners of his home had frozen solid, the frost crawling up the walls in feathered patterns of white that caught the firelight and glittered like something almost beautiful and entirely deadly. His children slept in shifts near the fire, wrapped in the heavy coats meant for the outdoors, and he and his wife took turns sitting up to keep the flames alive and to make sure no child drifted too far from the heat in their sleep. Cornelius sat awake through the long nights with his mind turning over and over on the same hard thought, the thought he could not put down no matter how he tried. He had warned the widow that stone would fail her. He had stood in her doorway in the warm light of August and told her, with all the certainty of his trade, with all the weight of his years and his knowledge, that she had built herself a tomb. He had watched the doubt move across her face, and he had ridden away believing he had done a kindness. And now he sat in his own freezing house, feeding a hearth that could not keep his children warm, watching the frost climb his careful walls, and he wondered for the first time in his life whether everything he knew about building had been built on a foundation that was only half the truth. At the settlement, the people gave up trying to hold their own homes against the storm and gathered together for warmth. They abandoned the smaller cabins and pressed into the general store and the little church, packing their bodies close, keeping the fires burning without rest, sharing what fuel they had, and watching the pile of it shrink with every hour. Lavinia, Ott the schoolteacher, a spare and dignified woman who had always kept her own small cabin neat as a pin and her own counsel neat as her cabin, found that she could not keep the place warm enough to stay alive in. She wrapped herself in every garment she owned, and she walked through the screaming white to a neighbor's house, counting the fence posts she could no longer see, and she moved in with them and swallowed her pride for the simple animal need to not freeze to death alone. The settlement had become a single huddled creature, fighting for its life, burning everything it had, praying for the storm to break before the wood ran out and the dark and the cold came in for good. 3 miles north, Adeline Merrick added 2 logs to her fire in the morning and then let it burn down to a bed of steady coals. The stone walls drank the heat quietly, the great mass of the rock and the banked earth and the buried northern wall, soaking it up and holding it the way her father had promised they would. Hours later, long after the flames had faded to a dull red glow, the warmth still filled the room, radiating out from the walls themselves, an even gentle heat that came from everywhere and from nowhere. Her children slept in the low loft, comfortable, without extra blankets, their faces flushed and peaceful in the dim light. She sat below them with her mending in her lap, and she listened to the wind, and she was not afraid of it. The wind roared and clawed at the world outside with a violence that had killed strong men that very night. It could not reach them. It threw itself against the stone and the earth and the buried hillside, and the stone and the earth and the hillside simply held the way they had held against 10,000 winters before this one, and they gave the storm nothing. On the second day, the storm worsened still. The snow moved sideways now in a solid blinding sheet, and the visibility dropped to nothing at all, so that a man who stepped 10 feet from his own door could lose it forever and freeze to death within sight of his own family. The temperature fell to 40 degrees below zero. To stand still outside in that air was to die. To breathe it too deeply was to feel the lungs themselves begin to seize. And inside the stone hut, the air stayed steady and warm. The walls were warm to the touch, even down near the floor, where the cold should have pooled, even in the far corner by the door, where Cornelius Wend had promised the damp and the chill would gather. Adeline fed the fire once in the evening and once again the next morning. 4 logs in a full day of the worst cold the basin had seen in living memory. 4 logs, while Ambrose Teller fed his wife's table into the flames, and the settlement burned through its winter stores in a single desperate night. But the stone hut was about to face a test that had nothing to do with the cold outside and everything to do with the thing that frightens every parent in the deep of a long winter. On the night of the second day, Adeline's youngest, her little girl woke crying with a fever. It came on the way fevers come on in children, fast and frightening, the small body suddenly burning hot to the touch, the breath gone short and rapid, the eyes glassy and far away in the firelight. And Adeline understood with a cold, clear terror that was worse than any wind that she was utterly alone. There was no doctor within 40 miles, and 40 miles might as well have been 40,000 in that storm. There was no neighbor she could reach. There was no door she could open without letting in a cold that would kill the child faster than any fever. She could not run for help. She could not send for help. She could only stay and tend her daughter and trust the thing she had built. And here in the longest, darkest hours of that second night, the stone hut proved itself in a way that no skeptic at the settlement store could ever have predicted, because a sick child needs more than a fire. She needs warmth that holds steady through the whole long night, not the violent swing between a scorching hearth and a freezing corner that ruled every timber cabin in the basin. In those cabins that night, a feverish child faced an impossible choice made by the house itself: lie close to the fire and breathe the smoke and the harsh, overheated air that cracked the throat and parched the lungs, lie away from the fire and shiver in air cold enough to deepen any sickness into something worse. There was no middle ground in a house that could not hold its heat, no place of even gentle warmth where a fevered body could simply rest. But the stone hut had no such cruelty in it. The heat that lived in the walls did not roar, and it did not vanish. It surrounded the room evenly, the same warmth by the door as beside the fire, the same warmth at the floor as in the loft. A steady, mild heat, with no smoke in it and no bite to it, the kind of warmth a sick child could lie in for hours without strain. Adeline laid her daughter on a pallet against the warm western wall, well back from the fire where the stone itself gave up its gentle heat all through the night. She bathed the small hot forehead with snow melted soft and tepid in a pan by the coals. She held the small hand in hers, and she did not let go, and slowly, hour by hour, the fever loosened its grip. The breathing eased and lengthened, the burning skin cooled to something near its own true warmth, and the glassy eyes closed at last into real and healing sleep. The very thing the men had laughed at, the very shelter the carpenter had warned would sicken her family, had carried her daughter through the worst night of her young life. Adeline sat in the warm, steady dark and wept quietly, so as not to wake the children, and she understood now in her bones what she had only believed before. Her father had been right. The old ways had been right. She had not built a tomb. She had built a refuge. She did not know it yet, but the refuge was about to be tested by something other than her own family. On the night of the third day, with the storm still howling and the temperature still locked far below zero, there came a sound at the door, not the wind which she knew now in all its voices, something heavier, something that was trying weakly to be heard above the storm, a pounding, slow and failing, the sound of a fist that had almost nothing left in it. Adeline rose in the firelight, and she stood for a long moment with her hand against the thick pine door, and she made a choice that every soul on the frontier dreaded having to make. To open that door was to let in the killing cold, to risk the warmth that was keeping her children alive, to invite in whatever might be standing out there in the dark. To leave it closed was to let a human being die 3 feet from her family alone in the snow while she listened. She thought of her own husband, gone under the river ice with no one near enough to reach for him, dying alone in the cold, while the world went on without knowing, and she lifted the latch and she opened the door. A man fell into the room. He came down across the threshold like a sack of grain, half frozen and worn down to nothing, his beard caked solid with ice, his hands curled into claws he could no longer feel or open. His name, she would learn, was Josiah Stark, a trapper who worked the high country to the north, a hard, solitary man who had been caught out by the storm and had sheltered for 3 days in a shallow cave before the cold and the hunger had driven him down toward the settlement in a last desperate gamble for his life. He had been walking blind through the white certain he was finished, his thoughts going slow and warm and dangerous, the way a freezing man's thoughts go, just before the end when he had remembered something he had heard once at the store, a joke about a fool widow living in a hut of stone somewhere north of the settlement. He had turned toward where he thought it might be, with nothing left to lose, expecting to find nothing, or to find a frozen ruin, or to find a corpse no warmer than himself. He had not expected to find a door that opened, and warmth that rolled out to meet him like a hand pulling him back from the edge, and a woman who dragged him inside and shut the storm away behind him. Adeline did for Josiah Stark what she had done for her daughter. She laid him near the warm wall, away from the direct heat of the fire that would have damaged his frozen flesh too quickly. She worked the ice from his beard with warm water. She rubbed the life slowly back into his ruined hands, patient and steady, knowing that to hurry, it was to harm him. She gave him broth, a spoonful at a time, and through the long hours of that third night, she kept him back from the edge of death by the simple, even warmth of the things she had built. And as the trapper came back to himself, as the feeling returned to his fingers, and the gray left his face, and his eyes cleared, and began to take in the room around him, he began to understand that he had walked into something he did not have words for. He was a man who had spent his whole life learning how to survive reading the land and the weather and the cold the way other men read books, and what he saw in that stone hut did not match anything in all his hard experience. He looked at the small fire burning low in the firebox, barely more than a bed of coals. He looked at the warmth that filled the room anyway, the deep even warmth that had no business existing around a fire that small. He pulled himself slowly upright, and he laid his thawing hand flat against the stone wall, and he felt the warmth coming out of the rock itself, steady and patient as though the wall were alive. He asked her how long the storm had been blowing, and she told him. 3 days. He asked her how much wood she had burned in that time, and she nodded toward the small stack drying under the lean-to inside the door. He looked at it. He counted it with the careful eye of a man who had spent his whole life counting the thin resources that stood between him and death. 10 logs, perhaps, a few more for 3 days and 3 nights of the worst cold he had ever known a human being to live through. He thought of his own camp in the high country, where he would have burned that much in half a day and still slept cold and shivering under his furs. He thought of the settlement he was trying to reach, where he knew without being told that the people would be burning their furniture, by now their chairs and their tables and the very floors under their feet. And he looked at this widow, this woman the whole country had laughed at and called a fool, sitting calm and unbothered in a house of stone, with her children sleeping easy and warm in the loft above her, having burned 10 logs, while the rest of the basin burned everything it owned. Josiah Stark was the first man to truly understand, the first to feel the warm stone under his own hand and grasp what it meant, and to know in his bones that it was not luck and not a trick, but something built on purpose by someone who knew exactly what she was doing. He said nothing for a long while. He was not a talkative man, and what he was seeing did not have easy words to wrap around it. But something had shifted behind his weathered face. Some old, hard certainty about the world had cracked and fallen away, and left something close to wonder in its place. When the gray light of the 4th morning finally came, and the wind at last began to die, and the great storm loosened its grip on the land and slunk away east, Josiah Stark gathered his strength and his thawed gear and made ready for the final walk to the settlement. At the door he stopped and turned back and looked at the warm stone room one more time, the low ceiling and the glowing coals and the woman and the sleeping children, as if to fix it all in his memory, as if to be certain he had not dreamed the whole of it in his dying. Then he stepped out into the bright, cruel, frozen world and started south through snow that came up past his thighs, carrying with him a story that he already knew even as he walked, that not one soul in the settlement was going to believe. Josiah Stark came down out of the white country late on the 4th day, half frozen still and worn thin as a blade, and when he finally reached the settlement, he found it exactly as he had known he would. Smoke hung low and gray over the buildings. The general store and the little church were crowded with exhausted people who had survived the night by huddling together and burning everything that would catch. There were the blackened remains of broken chairs in the ash. There were the legs of tables and the slats of beds and the staves of barrels. The whole settlement had the hollow-eyed look of a place that had been under siege and had barely held. And into that weary gathering came the trapper, frostbitten and gaunt and strange, with a story in his mouth that he could hardly believe himself even as he told it. He told them what he had seen. He told them about the widow's hut of stone 3 miles north, and how the door had opened to him when he was certain he was a dead man walking, and how the warmth had rolled out to meet him in the dark. He told them about the small fire burning low and the heat that came out of the walls, themselves steady, and even hours after the flames had faded to coals. He told them about the woodpile, about the 10 logs that had carried a woman and 2 children through 3 days and nights of 40 below, while the rest of the basin burned its own furniture in the dark. He laid his thawed hand flat in the air as he spoke the way he had laid it against that warm stone wall, trying to make them feel a thing that could only be felt and not told. At first, not one of them believed him. They were tired and cold and gutted by 3 days of fighting for their lives and a frost-bitten trapper telling them that a woman they had all laughed at had passed the whole storm in comfort on 10 logs in a hut of stone was simply more than they could swallow. Some of them thought the cold had touched his mind the way it touches the minds of men who walk too long through the white. Some of them thought he was stretching the truth the way men stretch the truth around a fire when they have a tale to tell. The widow's hut had been a joke for half a year, a grave with a chimney, and a joke does not turn into a miracle overnight in the minds of hard, practical people who have just buried their losses. So they let him talk, and they nodded, and they did not believe a word of it. But a story like that does not die just because it is doubted. It works its way in. It sits quiet in the back of the mind through the long, cold days that followed the storm, while the people dug their buried homes out from under the drifts and counted what they had lost and rationed the little fuel that remained to them. And one by one, almost against their own will, they began to find reasons to ride north. Some said they were only going to check on the widow to see whether she and her children had lived through it, though it had not crossed their minds to check on her before. Some said they were merely curious to see the strange little hut for themselves. But what every last one of them truly wanted was to feel the inside of that stone hut with their own bodies, to put their own bare hand flat against the wall and learn for certain whether the impossible thing the trapper had described was real or the raving of a half-frozen man. And every one of them found the same thing waiting. They found warm air in a calm, still space, and stone walls that gave back heat slowly and evenly hours after the fire had burned low. They found no ice on the inside of the door. They found no damp gathering in the corners, no mold creeping up the walls, none of the thick, choking air the carpenter had so confidently promised. They found no sting of smoke. They found only a steady, gentle warmth that seemed to come from everywhere at once, the warmth of stone that had drunk in the heat of a small fire and was giving it back in its own slow, patient time. They put their hands against the wall the way the trapper had, and they felt it, the warmth living in the rock and the laughter that had followed. Adeline Merrick, all through the summer and the fall, began very quietly to die in their throats. Adeline received every one of them the same way. She did not gloat. She did not remind them of the things they had said at the store, the grave with the chimney, the fool widow who would freeze before Christmas. She let them in out of the cold, and she let them lay their hands against the wall, and she answered their questions plainly when they asked, and she let the warmth do the talking that she herself would not do. She had never wanted to prove anyone wrong. She had only ever wanted to keep her children alive through the winter. That she had done it in a way that quietly shamed the whole basin was not a victory she had set out to win, and she took no pleasure in their amazement. Then late in November, a homesteader named Phineas Dorr rode out to the stone hut, and he brought with him something that none of the others had thought to bring. He was a careful, educated man who had come west from St. Louis, a man who trusted measurements over impressions, and he carried in his coat a thermometer, a real one, a precise instrument of glass and mercury that did not care about opinions or jokes or wounded pride. He asked Adeline whether he might take some readings, and she allowed it, and Phineas Dorr set about doing the one thing that no one in the entire Judith Basin had yet thought to do. he set about measuring the truth itself. He took his readings in the morning, at midday, and in the evening. He recorded the temperature outside, where the air stayed locked hard below freezing day after day after day. And then he recorded the temperature inside the stone hut, and what he found there did not move the way he expected it to move. It barely moved at all. 65 degrees, 68, 71, hour after hour, day after day, while the world outside stayed far below freezing. The air inside the hut held steady in the mild comfort of a spring afternoon. He could scarcely credit his own instrument. He took the readings again in different corners at different hours, certain he had made some error. The numbers did not change, and then he counted the wood, the way the trapper had counted it, but more carefully, still keeping a written record over the days he stayed to measure. Over a full week, Adeline Merrick burned fewer than 20 logs. Phineas Dorr knew his own cabin well, for he had built it and lived in it and shivered in it. It was nearly the same size inside as the stone hut, and in that same week, fighting the same cold, under the same sky, his own timber cabin had devoured more than 40 logs and still held cold spots near the floor where his children could not sit and play, more than twice the fuel for a colder, meaner, stingier warmth. He wrote the numbers down in his careful hand, and he looked at them for a long time in the lamplight, and the numbers said what no man's loud opinion had ever managed to say. The numbers spoke louder than all the laughter at the store had ever spoken. Adeline Merrick had not been lucky. She had not been a fool. She had been right, plainly and measurably right. And here was the cold, hard proof of it, set down in ink. When Phineas Dorr carried his figures back to the settlement, the story changed for good and all. A trapper's wild tale could be doubted. A widow's quiet warmth could be explained away by men who did not want to believe it. But columns of numbers written down by a sober, educated man, the same numbers measured 3 times over, and never wavering, those could not be laughed at and could not be waved aside. The men who had broken apart their own furniture to live through the storm looked at those figures, and they did the bitter arithmetic against their own ruined winters, and a hard new respect settled over the whole basin like the first real snow. The joke was finished. It had died in their throats, and it did not come back. What remained in its place was a question, and it was a question that would change the way men built their homes for a generation. How had she done it, and could it be done again? In December, when the worst of the digging out was behind them, and the people had time at last to think, Cornelius Wend rode back to the stone hut. He was the one man whose judgment had carried real weight in all of this, the carpenter, the builder, the man who had stood in her doorway in the warm light of August and warned her with the full authority of his trade that stone would choke her and rot her and fail her family by spring. He had spent the storm in his own freezing cabin, watching the frost climb his careful walls and his children sleep in shifts by the fire, haunted the whole long while by the thought that he might have been wrong. Now he came to find out for certain, and he came not as a doubter, looking to be proven right, but as a craftsman, ready to look honestly at the work and accept whatever it told him. He went over the hut the way only a builder can. He ran his hands slowly along the joints between the stones. He examined the corners low and high where the damp and the cold should have gathered first and worst. He studied the ceiling where the logs met the layer of clay and sod. He looked for the mold he had so confidently promised would come. He looked for the rot, for the moisture running down the inside of the walls, for the thick choking air he had warned her about with such certainty. He found none of it. The clay and sand mortar she had mixed by her dead father's old recipe had cured hard and clean. The walls were dry, the corners were dry, the air was clean and good. The stone breathed just enough and held just enough in a balance he had never believed was possible, a balance that came not from any book he had ever read, but from a knowledge older than any book. There was no rot, there was no mold, there was no damp anywhere in it. There was only a sound, dry, warm room that had carried a family and a half-dead stranger through the worst storm in the living history of the basin. Cornelius Wend stood in the middle of that warm, dry room for a long time, an honest man brought at last face to face with the hard edges of what he had known and what he had not. And then he said the three words that a proud man of skill finds hardest in all the world to say. He said that he had been wrong. He said it plainly to her face, with no excuse trailing behind it and no softening before it. He had warned her against the very thing that had saved her life and her children's lives, and he had the decency and the plain courage to stand in front of her and own it. And that was enough. Adeline did not need him to grovel, and he did not grovel. He was a craftsman, acknowledging better craft than his own, a man of knowledge, bowing his head to knowledge far older and deeper than what he carried. He had come to judge the work. The work had judged him instead, and he took the verdict like the honest man he was, and he rode home thinking hard about everything he had ever built. By January, no one in the Judith Basin was laughing anymore. By February, they had begun to copy her. Not exact copies, for each family worked with what it had and what it knew and what its hands could manage. Some built full stone huts, after her pattern, low and thick-walled, and banked deep with earth against the hillsides. Others could not manage so much, and instead raised heavy stone walls inside their existing log cabins, building in the mass to hold the heat that the bare timber let escape. Some tore out their small, stingy hearths and built them up into great stone heat walls that held warmth long after the fire had died, giving it back through the night the way Adeline's walls gave it back to her. The shape of the thing changed from homestead to homestead and from hand to hand, but the principle underneath it stayed the same wherever it traveled. Thick masts to hold the heat, low ceilings to keep it from rising away and dying against a cold roof. Few openings for it to leak through. The patient earth itself banked up high as insulation against the worst the sky could do. Ambrose Teller, the rancher who had called the hut a grave with a chimney, who had burned his own wife's good table to live through the storm, built a stone bunkhouse for his ranch hands before the next winter came. The men who slept in it burned half the wood and slept the whole night through without rising once to feed a fire, and Ambrose Teller did not say much out loud about where the idea had come from, but every man in the basin knew, and so did he. Phineas Dorr, the man with the thermometer and the careful written numbers, planned out a winter room of stone where his family could gather through the coldest months, and he had the figures in his own hand to know exactly why it would hold and exactly how much it would save. Even Lavinia Ott, the schoolteacher who had fled her own cabin in the heart of the storm to keep from freezing alone, came at last to see the hut for herself, and she stood inside it in the steady, gentle warmth, and she called it a fortress. And from her, careful and sparing as she was with her words, the word was the highest praise she knew how to give. Through all of it, Adeline Merrick never once claimed the credit. She never lectured a single soul. She never stood at the settlement store and reminded the men of the jokes they had made at her expense, never asked for thanks or recognition or so much as an apology beyond the one the carpenter had freely and honestly given her. She simply went on living the way she always had, raising her 2 children, feeding her fire twice a day, and letting the stone do the rest of the work the way it had been built to do. And winter after winter, year after year, while her neighbors hauled and split and stacked and burned and hauled again, her own woodpile stayed higher than anyone's in the whole basin, the quiet visible proof of a truth she had never once needed to argue out loud. What she understood was a simple thing, and it was the very thing the frontier, in all its hurry, had forgotten. Heat was never about how fast a person could burn fuel. It was about where the heat went once it was made. A timber cabin heats the air, and air is a restless and a faithless thing that rises and slips through every gap and is gone into the night, so that a man must burn and burn and burn just to keep replacing what he is forever losing. But stone heats mass, and mass stays. Stone takes the heat in slowly and holds it close and gives it back slowly, patiently, all through the longest, darkest night, asking nothing in return but a small, steady fire and the wisdom to build the right way around it. Adeline had not fought the cold. She had understood it, and she had made it serve her exactly as her father had told her long ago that a person could, if only they would listen. And this was the deepest truth of the whole story, the thing that gave it all its quiet and lasting weight. Adeline Merrick had not invented any of it. She had only remembered it. Her father had learned it from the old stone builders of Cornwall, and those builders had learned it in their turn from the generations that came before them, a long, unbroken chain of patient, hard-won knowledge, reaching back further than anyone could name or trace, all the way down to the first people who ever pressed a shelter into the side of a hill and felt the earth itself hold their small warmth against the great dark and the cold. Somewhere along the long road west, in all the rush to fell the timber and throw up the cabins and tame the wild country fast, the people of the frontier had let that knowledge slip quietly through their fingers and fall away behind them. They had forgotten. Adeline had not. She had carried it in her memory through 3 hard winters and a husband's death under the river ice and a whole long summer of laughter. And when the great storm finally came to test every one of them, her memory had stood firm and warm and unbroken, exactly where their cabins had failed and frozen. The stone hut still stands today, not as a home anymore, but as a quiet, weathered structure on a hillside north of what is now Lewistown, Montana, low and easy to miss from the road, the way it was always easy to miss. The roof has been replaced more than once over the long stretch of years, but the walls have not moved. The walls she laid by hand, stone by stone, checking each course against her dead father's worn plumb line, stand exactly where she set them, as square and true as the day she finished the last of them. And if you step inside on a cold winter afternoon when the wind is coming down hard and mean off the mountains, the way it came down in the November of 1883, you can still feel it. You can feel the warmth rising gently out of stone that has drunk in the low winter sun, the same patient warmth that once carried a widow and 2 children and a half-dead stranger through the worst night the basin had ever known. The frontier laughed at her. The whole country was certain she would fail and waited almost eagerly for the failing. And when the winter finally showed its teeth, when the blizzard came that froze the wells solid and collapsed the roofs across 2 whole counties and drove proud, strong men to burn their own tables in the dark, the stone hut answered back without a single word. It simply stood, it simply held, and it kept its people warm. Some lessons in this world are not invented by clever men. They are only remembered by patient ones, and the lessons that are truly worth the remembering have a way of outlasting every loud and certain voice that ever doubted them.